The warmest month on record since 1880 was July of this year. Set the record as the warmest month in history. Until August, which tied it. So the two warmest months since 1880 in the history of taking records was July and August of this year. You can make the argument that things have changed. In 1942, President Roosevelt said to all the car companies, no more cars are going to be made. He said, you can't make any more cars. All resources have to be funneled towards helping us in the war and making heavy-duty machinery and weapons. They banned the sale of private automobiles in the United States. They took every single resource and focused it on the production of equipment to fight in the war. This was in the beginning of Lester Brown's book. So assume that the country's not really getting all the things you're saying, we're not aware of the potential, and we keep having these radical disturbances in our climate. At some point, assume someone's going to say, hey, wait a minute, this is not a problem for 50 years from now. This has to be dealt with immediately. And assume they said to each of you, you're in charge of fixing the problem. So in terms of fixing the environmental issues and the other issues related to this, if you were fully in charge and everyone was eager to listen and learn, and we were interested in promoting your 5 best solutions on social media and at work and everywhere, if people would listen to you, what are the 5 things that you would like to implement that everyone could follow? What are your very best 5 suggestions to solve all of these problems as rapidly and urgently as we can, assuming that the situation has progressed and it's no longer a 2050 issue, it's a 2016 issue?
Sure. Great question, by the way. I can sum my thoughts up pretty quickly on this. I think the five most important actions that we could take today or that I would support would be, one, of course, is to, and this is not in order of importance, one is to decrease our use of fossil fuels, which is no news. The second is to decrease waste, which is no news. The third is to increase to help assist policymakers with decision making by influencing them as much as possible on those things that will create the greatest change. And the fourth would be to increase education. And the fifth would be a combination of all those to do whatever we can, as I said, in a combination of all those things to not reduce, but to get our agricultural systems to the point as quickly as possible to create regeneration of the largest amount of sequestration that we can possibly do and the least amount of greenhouse gases that we can emit. And in doing that, the equation would be to eat only plant-based foods. And that's the quickest route because we are not going to be able to, it's nearly impossible to reduce fossil fuels and waste in the amount of time that where we can create measurable change, and yet we can change out what we eat, and we can do it today. Lastly, as an example, is that by all indications, just moving to alternative fuel, it will take about 34 years and about $1 trillion per year. And again, by all indications, we need to reduce our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, human-induced, by half of the 54 gigatons by the year 2020. It used to be 20% by 2020, and now all climate scientists agree that it probably should be half. And we have to get it net greenhouse gas emissions to get it to net zero by the year 2050. And the easiest way to do that is by moving through plant-based systems. That's the quickest and easiest way to do it. I understand there's a pragmatism issue here, but that is the quickest way to do it.
I'm not sure about the list of 5, but I'll give you my thoughts on that. First of all, I've been studying did study a little bit about the meat consumption on a global scale, and I found that 72% of the meat, pork, and dairy, beef, pork, and dairy, was eaten in 5 regions of the world. China being number 1, Europe number 2, U.S. number 3, Brazil and Russia 4 and 5. And I kind of computed that 72% that 72% of that meat was being eaten by the wealthiest 2 billion people in the world. And don't ask me exactly how I extrapolated that number, but there's a lot of people that don't eat much meat, and there's a lot of people that eat a lot of meat. And so I think we need to go in the direction of the people that are eating the most meat. Now, in my presentation yesterday, I talked about an extrapolation I'd made about meat consumption, and in the United States, it's leveled off, and it's going down a little bit in beef, and in Europe, it's leveled off quite a bit. But in China, they've gone from tying us a couple of decades ago. Now they eat twice as much meat as we do in China, and so there's a tendency, I think, for us to become complacent of the public that things are getting better. That we're eating less meat, and there's more vegan restaurants, and this and that, and there's more solar panels on the roofs. But I think that's a mistake to become complacent, because if you extrapolate the data, I concluded that for every American or European that's trying to move toward a plant-based diet, moving in that direction, there's up to 100 people in the developing world moving in the other direction. And not only that, they're buying a car for the first time. So I think the numbers we talked about earlier, 9.5 billion people by mid-century, and the tonnage of meat that's going to keep going up, I just don't think that's going to happen. I think there's going to be some terrible things happen if we don't learn to manage it. I refer to two books in my presentations that I consider wake-up calls, and one's by Lester Brown, Full Planet, Empty Plates. The other one is by Dr. Stephen Emmott, 10 Billion. And I consider particularly Emmott's book, I call it a book for leaders, because I think he does an outstanding job in a 1-hour read of describing what's probably going to happen if we don't get a handle on things. And I had an opportunity to visit with him in London a few years ago, just after that book came out, and he had concluded that we weren't going to make it till the end of this century as a civilization, and he's got a lot of credentials to support his conclusions. But I asked him, I said, if we could convince the 80% of the people that are eating the most meat to replace 75% of their meat and dairy calories with plants, do you think your projection of us collapsing as a civilization would change? And he said he couldn't compute that. He couldn't answer that without computing it, but it would take him a while. But he did say that there would be an enormous benefit to our overall global ecology environment if that were to take place. So my feeling is, I totally agree with Richard. We're running out of time, and things have to change quickly. And based on my background as a business executive and an executive recruiter, I think it boils down to leadership. And I have not run across a single powerful leader in the world that's really as concerned about this as probably everybody in this room is. And I'm pretty passionate about the topic, and I believe that a single powerful leader with as much passion and conviction as I have would take us a long way towards solving this problem, and I think that's coupled with money. So I'm in the process of sorting through billionaire candidates, if you will, or people with global reputation, positive global reputations, and either have a lot of money or access to a lot of money. And I believe that a person like that, it only takes one, could build a team of other people like that and commence a global awareness campaign, a massive global awareness campaign, never ending, And some people say, well, are you crazy? How much would that cost? And I said, well, I don't know what it would cost, but pick a number, 5 billion, 10 billion. How much communication to everybody in the world that's got a laptop or an iPhone could you get done with $5 or $10 billion? And if you had credible messengers, you could start changing some habits pretty quickly, and you keep going. And so, what is the number? Well, Facebook just bought WhatsApp for $22 billion. You know, WhatsApp, half the people in the room may not even know what WhatsApp is. I didn't a couple of years ago, and I was traveling overseas. But if a simple app for a smartphone is worth $22 billion, what is a future of our civilization worth? So maybe it's $100 billion that this group of wealthy people pull together and really start pulling out the stops. We've never been in a better position to communicate with every person in the world that's connected to some electronic device. Things can happen pretty quickly. We could mobilize like we did in World War II, but I don't see it happening without powerful leadership that can go directly to the consumer. You can't go to governments and start messing around with trying to strike deals. You got to go to the demand side of the equation and get people demanding plant-based foods. I think it all boils down to getting people to go to plant-based foods, and I'll probably go to my grave thinking that. Thank you.
Okay, so I started off talking about meatification and that as that really fundamental context for thinking about these global issues. And at the end of my book, I talk about the case for demeatification and argue that the whole book builds towards the argument that this is one of the most fundamental social justice issues today. It's one of the most fundamental issues that bears on climate change, biodiversity loss, our interaction with other species directly and indirectly. And so I think the demeatification imperative is something that we need to be fighting on many fronts to pursue and building alliances with people who are working on climate justice, people who are communicating why this is such an important social justice issue for global equity and global inequalities, people who care about, obviously, our relationship with other animals and the loss of biodiversity. So the demeatification imperative, on one level, I know these huge exploding populations of animals could be imploded very quickly if we stopped artificially inseminating them. The livestock in North America is overwhelmingly reproduced through artificial insemination. The animals can't even reproduce themselves. They've been so modified, and the systems have been organized to accelerate their turnover time. And put on and gain weight, so that's part of that basic genetics. So in some ways, that's a very simple thing. If we stopped inseminating artificially inseminating, violating animals, it could be a very quick implosion of this, what I call this other population bomb that a lot of environmentalists don't talk about. And related to this and Steve's big question of the basic things that need to change. A basic thing that needs to change is stop funneling huge volumes of grain and oilseed through livestock. And that has obviously huge economic compulsions to that. It's one of the big ways, and a lot of, I think, environmental people concerned with these issues don't appreciate how important livestock has been as a way of absorbing surpluses and enabling them to still be profitable. So livestock as a way of profitably absorbing grain and oilseed surpluses. So I think there needs to be a real attention to how ways of stopping cycling of grains and oilseed through livestock. And one of that relates back to the subsidy point that David was saying. The subsidies are so skewed towards the big industrial producers, and there's a need to fight over those battles. That's a very real political battle, and this whole story is fighting over the redirection of subsidies to small agroecological farmers at every scale, in education systems, but also into applied extension in our universities. The land-grant universities where a lot of the ag research is done here is overwhelmingly skewed towards the big agricultural corporations where there's a handful of dominant players in seeds and chemicals and animal pharmaceuticals, and increasingly those are all intertwined, those inputs. I just want to, my last thing I'll say is just to clarify the point about, because we've mentioned China at a few different points, and I'll talk a bit about China tomorrow. China is often presented as this bogey man in this whole picture, and it is phenomenal increases, and it was mentioned that China has doubles the US production. But in per capita terms, the US doubles China. So when we talk about dehumidification, it starts here. It starts in North America and Europe and the richest countries in the world. And in fact, China's ahead, for many years, the Chinese government has actually aggressively pursued medification as a state goal, as a marker of development, a marker of modernity, with some of the stuff that Jean was talking about, power. The government really celebrated and officially supported the medification of Chinese diets to an incredible extent. In 1980, the average Chinese person consumed far below the world average in per capita consumption of meat. Now they're far above the world average. But that double the American production, again, on a per capita basis, is still much less than the US. So the average person in China is a bit more than half of what the average American eats. So China is still far below. But on a quite hopeful note, recently, and this drew a fair bit of attention earlier this year, the Chinese government basically recognized this is a crash course. This is a disaster. China is home to about a fifth of humanity. It's home to half the world's pigs. How are those pigs being fed? Increasingly, those pigs are being fed from soybeans that are coming from South America. And the Chinese government has this year made basically recognition, an explicit recognition, this trajectory is not sustainable. And they're arguing that there needs to be, rather than the continuing meatification of Chinese diets as a pursuit of the state, they're saying actually the Chinese diet needs to cut out its meat, or not cut out it entirely, but reduce on a very significant scale. And they set very aggressive targets. Now, whether that materializes or not, remains to be seen. But it's quite notable that the state recognized this is a disastrous trajectory for climate, for water. China also has huge water scarcity issues in its north area, like the U.S., over-reliance on freshwater resources, including an underground aquifer that's being depleted very drastically. And so the state basically recognized this needs to change and has set some targets. Now, whether that materializes again is another thing that remains to be seen, but I think there's something hopeful there, and the state really a very big U-turn from what it said. Now, now whether the Chinese corporations agree with that, we'll see. A few years ago, one of the big Chinese giants, Shineway, bought out the biggest pig producer in the U.S., Smithfield. So they have very aggressive global plans that might not exactly fall in line with that aspiration that the state has set. But I do think that is one potentially hopeful thing that's emerged in recent years.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point, and we'll also be expanding on the China issue tomorrow at 11. It's a really big deal. And then you wouldn't think China's going to be the example, but that's what I was talking about, or in my head I was talking about, because I'll talk about it in my presentation tomorrow, so I might not have actually said it out loud here. But the U.S. really needs to take a lead and be a global leader, and that's part of the reason that as individuals, our patterns, our priorities make such a big difference, because if we can change U.S. priorities, not only are we changing our own consumption patterns, which are massive overconsumption patterns, but we're so powerful globally that we're going to change international patterns, and we want to set the example. So I think I did reference it a little bit. We want to be the example, say, don't follow us, learn from our bad habits. And so that's what China is doing right now. They're saying, this is too much. And they're pulling it back. Hopefully, at least they intend to. Steve, you kind of gave a little bit of a magic wand with the way you framed that question, so I'm going to take that as a magic wand and make myself very powerful right now. So first would be food reform. I had somebody ask me a long time ago, they're like, if you could make meat illegal, you would. And it was a bad thing. I was like, oh, yes, I would. Yes, I would, absolutely. So animal agriculture, be gone. It's gone. Magic wand. I'm going to take the food reform a little bit further. So we're going to also just, in general, break up monopolies and decorporatize the food system. So food is going to be a basic right. It's not going to be profit driven. And we're going to do food for health. So you know what else I'm going to get rid of? Junk food. That's right. Bye-bye. Tiramisu, bye-bye. I don't care if it's vegan. Nope. Food for health, food for health. I don't eat that way. I just want to tell you, I went for quite some time on a vegan pizza and pudding binge, and as an adult, I was like, well, I can eat pudding first. I don't have to eat it, and then I was like, oh, I could have it second too. So I really would sandwich, pudding, pizza, pudding, but it was vegan. But if I ruled the world, none of that would happen. Okay, so that was one, food reform. Second, population, and this is really important when we're talking about global sustainability and balancing population and consumption concerns. So I am not saying this in a way that is broad strokes. So this is actually practical. So to help with the population concerns is we have to increase women's empowerment. We have to get schools, girls educated, decrease the gender biases and discrimination, get rid of gender discrimination, get rid of racial discrimination. So when you're talking about the population growth, that is primarily happening in the lower and middle income countries, and that's happening a lot in Africa and a lot in Asia, and India is where you're seeing those birth growth rates. And that's how it's framed. And people over there having all those babies causing all those problems. You can never talk about population and be fair and be effective without talking about the consumption levels in the U.S., in the high-income countries, because it's not the people having the babies that are causing the consumption issues. It's the high-income consumers. But population, it is a concern, and especially when you have a country like China with 1.4 billion people almost, or about to reach there, what they're doing matters a lot. And so I'm really glad that you brought out the point about, yes, they eat twice as much meat as the US, but they're 4 times as large. So per person, they're only eating half as much meat as we are, and already they get it and are reeling it back. So population versus consumption, we got to really be balanced and be careful of the blame game on that. So that's actually practical, but working on managing population. I would cap economic disparities and put a strong safety net. So again, also one of the reasons population growth is such an issue is you have massive amounts of childhood death. So the high infant mortality rates. If people's babies aren't dying, if they can assume for sure that they're going to live and then invest in them, they won't have as many babies, and they also have to be able to have the means to control birth rates. So women have to be empowered with the means to control their own reproductive cycles. So again, on the capping the economic disparities, of course, increase renewables, public transportation, that's a given also, but then finally, reforest. So climate change is going to take us out. Again, reforesting is what we have. It's the lungs of the globe. Also, the lungs of the globe is the ocean. Again, I'm not the aquatic expert, but we are getting rid of animal agriculture, so that includes fish, so that's going to help the oxygen abilities of the ocean as well.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. No, I agree with that, and I think it's important to incentivize those kinds of behaviors. Incentivize through taxing policy behaviors that don't cause harm like our current system does. Right now we're incentivizing overproduction of grain, overproduction of dairy, and then the government buys 20 million pounds of excess cheese to feed to kids. And the amount of cow's milk people are drinking in the US has actually been going down, but if they can make cheese out of that cow's milk, they can still use a lot of it. And so the government has incentivized this massive production, and then it pushes it out through these nutrition programs. So, and then there are external costs associated with that are not counted for, heart disease and the health problems that come from eating too many animal foods. So if we just stopped subsidizing a messed up system that causes so much harm, that depletes resources, destroys forests, acidifies the oceans, I think we would see a big shift. I think we also need to look at like agricultural taxes. You know, right now ranchers, for example, get tax breaks and they get tax money to go kill those wolves, you know, out west when they shouldn't be. So this is another example of where we're spending money on something that doesn't make sense. It's helpful for a very small number of individuals, these 2 ranchers, for example, and causing harm to the environment, to animals, and to the commonwealth, the common good. So I think the ideal scenario would be small, community-oriented, plant-based agriculture, in many cases women growing food in communities, and just community-based agriculture where, for instance, somebody would be growing maybe apples, their neighbor would be growing peaches, and then they would share. That's a nice thing about that kind of a system, is that the earth can be so abundant. And when people are living in this way and not afraid of scarcity, and I really like the idea of food as a right, not as sort of a profit thing. I also like the idea of health care as a right, not something that you're afraid of not getting. So making it so people are safe and cared for is the ideal. How do we get there? I think we just stop incentivizing irresponsible behavior. That's sort of the first step, and that's through the whole farm bill and the subsidy system. And one thing I'll say too about exports is we also have an export enhancement program where there's federal money that goes into promoting U.S. animal foods around the world. So that's another example of a subsidy that is promoting unhealthy practices here and pushing them around the world. And I think China does present us with a very interesting and I think positive example of trying to rein in our own human irresponsible behavior and acting rationally, ultimately.
They say it's good to be king. So if I were king, I would introduce 5 things, and they may not all be legal, they may not all be democratic or constitutional. But this is what I would do if I were dictator and I could just say, this is the way it's going to be. To reduce meat consumption in this country, number 1, a meat tax. We don't tax food, but we could tax meat. We could make it more expensive, less desirable. We could take that money from those taxes, not only subsidize fruits and vegetables, but use it for point number 2, which would be direct consumer education. You have to go through an education program. You have to take classes if you're going shopping for food for your family. You teach whoever it is, the mother, the father, the oldest child, whoever goes shopping, so that they are completely aware of the consequences of their purchases. You could even have direct consumer education in the supermarket. Show pictures of those chickens in those battery cages. This is where your eggs come from. If that was required, guess what? People would not buy those eggs, or they would buy them a lot less, because if anybody's seen a battery cage, it's one of the most disgusting things you've ever seen. Even things like cookbooks. I mean, people just don't even know how to cook vegetarian food or vegan food. And it's a really practical sort of street level thing, but maybe we should have mandatory classes in how to cook vegetarian. People think of it as bland and unattractive, and my family's not going to eat it. But I've had some excellent food that didn't have a piece of meat in it, obviously. One cuisine that comes to mind is Middle Eastern cuisine. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. It's absolutely the best food in the world, and it's virtually all vegetarian, or a lot of it is. Then I would take money out of policy making as much as I could. Certainly, I think a lot of people would agree that Citizens United is something that probably should go. Now, that's putting money into political campaigns, but I would also put a cap on lobbying, so that Archer Daniels Midland or Cargill or the Farm Bureau could only spend X number of dollars every year in lobbying politicians. Now, that's the most problematic, because I'm very much in favor of the First Amendment, and I do believe in free speech, and I think that's attached. Free speech is the same as, money, it's a very conservative position, but I do have a libertarian streak in me as well, and I think that, spending money is kind of equivalent to speaking freely. But why not put a cap on the amount of lobbying that goes into supporting things like subsidies for meat producers? Number 4, I would require every household to become a net producer of food, whether it's on your rooftop, in your garden or in a community garden. Because A, if you raise that food, you're going to be far more likely to eat it, and you have ownership of it, and you know where it came from, and you've put in blood, sweat, and tears to make it happen. So if you grow your own vegetables, you're going to eat your own vegetables, and you're going to eat a lot more vegetables. Listen to me, you're going to eat your vegetables. And then fifthly, I think health warnings. We should have packages with what meat, what cholesterol, what pesticides, antibiotics, all the things that come in to our bodies from consuming these products can do to us. Explicit, grotesque even. I was in Canada a little while ago, and I was just literally shocked by the cigarette packs. They show pictures of a lung with cancer. They show, it's graphic and it's disturbing, and it makes you never want to smoke a cigarette again in your life. So why not show pictures of what overconsumption of animal products can do to people? Again, none of these things are going to happen, unfortunately, but if I could make things happen, if I were to choose 5 things, those would be the 5 things I do.